Guys, what's the most messed up thing you saw or did in a sleepover? This was one of those adult sleepovers that starts off as a fun party and spirals into something you can't quite forget. A group of us gathered at a friend's house for a casual hangout. Among the crew was my friend Katie, who had brought along a guy she was seeing, and his friend who went by the name of Piss. Yes, you read that right. His name was literally Piss. You can't make that up. Now, Katie was getting pretty hot and heavy with her date, and at some point, she started pushing me to take one for the team and hook up with Piss. Naturally, I was horrified and said, "Hell no." Piss was, well, let's just say he wasn't my type. Anyway, Katie managed to get laid by her date, while the rest of us just went to sleep in the available bedrooms. I ended up in bed with my gay best friend. We were just hanging out, chatting a bit and winding down from the party. Meanwhile, Piss wandered into the room and decided to sleep on the floor, which seemed a little odd, but whatever. Maybe he was still holding on to hope that being in the same room as me would somehow lead to something? God help me. About 20 minutes later, everything took a turn for the worse. My best friend and I started hearing this incredibly loud and unmistakable sound. Piss was, for lack of a better word, furiously petting his dong on the floor. The noise was so clear, we both froze in absolute shock. I couldn't believe what was happening. We held each other's hands, trying to stay calm, but at that point, all we could do was quietly freak out in terror. The next morning was beyond awkward. The tension in the air was thick, and everyone tried to act like nothing had happened, but it was impossible to forget what we had heard. I never saw Piss again after that night. To this day, it's one of those memories I wish I could scrub from my brain, but it remains one of the most bizarre experiences I've ever had. Story 2. I once bathed my friend. It happened when two of us stayed at a friend's house in our early teens. We made the questionable decision to raid their parents' liquor cabinet, completely oblivious to how alcohol actually works. In just a few hours, we drank almost every type of liquor we could find, chasing shots with popsicles and eating animal crackers to mask the taste of gin. It was a chaotic, sugary, and very poor life choice. At some point, one of us stood at the top of a small staircase leading into the living room. It was only about 4 steps high, but he was swaying, gripping the railing for dear life. His face turned pale before he suddenly projectile vomited with astonishing force. The vomit bypassed the stairs entirely and splashed onto the floor below, leaving the steps surprisingly clear, except for a few stray drops. Then, as if on cue, he lost his balance, tumbled down the stairs, and landed in the mess he'd just created. Instead of being horrified, he burst into laughter, lying in a pool of his own vomit. We dragged him to the bathroom, stripped off his clothes, and shoved him into the shower. His thick, curly hair was matted with a paste of bright red popsicle and animal crackers. He was a mess. As I handed him shampoo, he kept yelling, "Don't tell anyone I have a small dong." When he finally put out his hands for the shampoo, he smeared it all over his face instead of his hair, which made him gag and sent his eyes burning. That's when I realized I'd have to take over. I scrubbed him clean, all while trying not to laugh at the absurdity of the situation. We didn't have spare clothes for him, so we borrowed some from our friend's brother, who was significantly larger. The best we could do was tie a belt tightly around an enormous pair of parachute-like shorts to keep them on him. After that, we collapsed into bed, convincing ourselves that no one in the house had heard a thing. If you think this story is untrue, the reason I remember it so well is because that friend shouting about his dong had a bigger dong than me, and you never forget finding out your pickle is small. Story 3. When I was a kid, I stayed at my aunt and uncle's house for a sleepover and ended up playing with matches. My cousin and I were in the kitchen lighting matches and tossing them into the sink to put them out. At one point, the head of a match flew off, still smoking, and landed somewhere in the shelving unit by the sink. We looked for it, but couldn't find it. This was the 80s, so all those kids, "Don't play with matches" ads were everywhere. A few hours later, my aunt woke us up, yelling for us to get out of the house because it was on fire. We stood outside and watched the entire house burn to the ground. I was absolutely terrified and convinced the whole thing was my fault. I didn't say a word about what we'd done earlier, but the guilt ate away at me for years. When I was about 15, I finally confessed to my aunt, expecting anger or disappointment. Instead, she burst out laughing, hugged me, and explained that the fire had been caused by faulty wiring in the back bedroom. She couldn't believe I'd been carrying that guilt all those years. It wasn't until I was an adult and learned about fire investigations that I fully understood it wasn't just an assumption. They knew it hadn't been us. So, technically, The most messed up thing I did on a sleepover was accidentally traumatize myself for years over something I didn't even do. Story 4. A small gathering at Connor's house to celebrate his birthday, just a typical night with friends. The group consisted of Connor, the birthday guy, along with his friends Antoine, Katie, and Kayla. The night was going as expected, drinks flowing, weed being passed around, and the usual party games like beer pong and Smash Brothers. At some point, Antoine and Katie decided to sneak upstairs to, well, take their party to the next level. They headed into Connor's room, which, for some unknown reason, was off-limits for everyone else. No one really noticed at first, but eventually someone decided to peek into the room. That's when we realized what was going down. Antoine and Katie were in the middle of things, and we couldn't help but be a-holes about it. Naturally, a group of us gathered outside Connor's room, and someone slowly cracked the door open. The rest of us barged in, causing Antoine and Katie to jump up in full panic mode. They scrambled to get dressed while Connor started giving them a hard time, mainly about the fact they had done their thing in his bed, of all places. And then came the moment that really made the night unforgettable. Someone shifted one of the pillows on the bed, and underneath it, there was a giant blood stain. Turns out Katie had gotten her period while they were getting busy in the one room they were explicitly told not to go into. Cue the chaos. Kayla, who was already pretty hammered by this point, along with Connor, lost their crap on Antoine and Katie. There was a solid hour of uncomfortable tension as they argued and yelled at them, until Antoine and Katie finally left, getting picked up by their parents. But the best part? After Antoine and Katie were gone, Connor and Kayla, freshly changed sheets and all, ended up getting loud and started banging. It made the whole situation even more awkward for the rest of us, but we all agreed that, despite everything, it was one hell of a night. Story 5. In Boy Scouts, I was the designated morning cook. My job was to wake up before everyone else to chop wood, start a fire, and get water boiling. One chilly, dewy morning, I grabbed the hatchet and started splitting a log into small splinters for kindling. As I swung the hatchet upward, my hand slipped on the handle, and the hatchet flew out of my grasp, hurtling a good 10 to 15 yards straight toward the tent circle. It came down hard, slicing right through the roof of a tent where 4 scouts were sound asleep. I froze, my heart pounding, waiting for someone to start screaming. I must have sat there for over a minute, paralyzed by fear. When no sounds came, I started to worry someone might actually be hurt. I quietly crawled over to the tent where the hatchet had landed. Carefully, I unzipped the flap and peered inside. To my immense relief, the hatchet had embedded itself in a bag of clothes, just inches from one scout's head. Moving as silently as possible, I snuck in, grabbed the hatchet, and slipped back out. I zipped the tent closed like nothing had happened and went back to finish making breakfast. At breakfast, the scouts from that tent were grumbling about how raccoons had clawed a hole in their perfectly good tent. I kept my head down, flipping pancakes, and didn't say a word. Story 6. In 10th grade, my friend decided to throw a small party at her house while her parents were gone for the week. Fast forward to around 3 a.m., and I find myself lying in bed next to her. She's fast asleep on the right side, while I'm wide awake. Suddenly, I hear a faint sound to my left. I turn my head to investigate, and that's when I see her. It's a little blonde girl, skin blue, almost like in a negative image, wearing a white pajama dress and holding a teddy bear. Classic ghostly imagery, but I swear I panicked in that moment. I immediately pulled the covers over my head. The faint noise I'd heard was her breathing, and I could feel her getting closer to me. The left side of my head, shoulder, and arm went ice cold. I shook my friend desperately, whispering, "Anna, there's a frigging ghost in your room." Half awake, she sleepily mumbled, "Just ignore her and she'll leave." I was beyond confused. What kind of response was that? To my surprise, after about 2 minutes, the little girl disappeared. I didn't sleep a wink that night. The next morning, my friend casually tells me that sometimes the ghost visits her room or the basement at night. She wasn't fazed at all. I know some people don't believe in ghosts, but that was one of the most terrifying experiences I've ever had. There's just no logical explanation for it. Story 7. When I was 14, I went to a sleepover at my buddy's house. He lived on a ranch, so the whole experience felt different from the usual suburban hangouts. That night, we stayed up late, parked in the living room, glued to his old TV, while playing 007 GoldenEye on the Nintendo 64. The room was dimly lit by the TV screen, and the sound of pixelated explosions filled the air. By the time we finally called it quits, it was probably close to 2 a.m. He crashed on the couch, and I claimed a giant beanbag chair on the floor. It wasn't the most comfortable spot, but with a blanket wrapped around me, it was good enough to pass out. I was exhausted from hours of gaming, junk food, and the occasional sugar-fueled yelling match. Sometime around 4 a.m., I had a dream that I got up to use the bathroom. In my dream, it was all very routine. I walked to the bathroom, did my business, and went back to the beanbag chair to sleep. Except, I didn't actually go to the bathroom. When I woke up, I was hit with a horrifying realization. I had completely peed myself. The beanbag chair was soaked. My blanket was soaked. I was soaked. Panic set in immediately. I was mortified. I was 14 years old, and the idea of anyone finding out was unbearable. I couldn't let my friend, or worse, his family, discover what had happened. I quickly jumped into action. First, I peeled off my soaked inners and put on the spare clothes I had packed. Then, I tried to figure out how to deal with the evidence. I balled up the wet blanket and snuck it into their coat closet, which seemed safe because it was summertime and no one would be reaching for a jacket anytime soon. The beanbag chair was a bigger problem. There was no hiding it in the house. It was way too big. So, in a moment of sheer desperation, I lugged it outside to their dumpster. Luckily, living on a ranch meant the dumpster was far enough away from the house that no one would notice me sneaking around at 4 a.m. I tossed the beanbag chair in, along with my soaked inners, and hurried back inside before anyone could catch me. I spent the rest of the night on the floor with nothing but my hoodie as a makeshift blanket. I barely slept, alternating between feeling cold and worrying that someone would notice the missing beanbag chair or open the coat closet. The next morning, my buddy didn't say a word about the blanket or the beanbag chair. Either he didn't notice, or he was too polite to mention it. I played it cool, pretending everything was normal, but I couldn't help imagining what might happen when his parents eventually opened the coat closet or spotted the beanbag chair in the dumpster. To this day, I have no idea if anyone ever found out, but that night has haunted me as one of the most embarrassing moments of my teenage years. Lesson learned: don't trust a dream bathroom. Story 8. One night, a group of us guys got drunk and decided to go streaking on the beach. It felt like the thing to do at the time, and we thought it would be hilarious. After we came back from the ocean, one of my friends couldn't find his clothes. Luckily, he had a change of clothes at a friend's house, but at that moment, we just left him on the pitch-black beach. We promised we'd go back and find him with his clothes later. Of course, being grade school guys, we couldn't resist messing with him. We waited a couple of hours, and then, feeling mischievous, we set out to find him. When we finally got there, he was livid. Apparently, he'd encountered several midnight walkers, tourists out for a late-night stroll, and had to run back into the ocean to avoid being seen. We couldn't stop laughing at the thought of him in that situation. Afterward, we played Super Nintendo games until the sun came up. We went back to the beach the next day but never found his original clothes. That was 24 years ago, and it's still one of our favorite stories to laugh about. Story 9. I was in the bathroom when I overheard whispers. It was clear they were planning a prank on me. I figured their plan would be to burst in unexpectedly, breaking the door open while I was inside. To turn the tables, I decided to pretend I was on the toilet, but instead, I braced myself against the door, pressing my palms firmly against it and using my weight to keep it shut. Unfortunately, that wasn't their plan. They assumed I was sitting far from the door, so their idea was to thrust a sword through it as a joke. The sword pierced straight through the door, and then right through the palm of my right hand. Blood was everywhere. The sword was withdrawn quickly, leaving me in shock. I vaguely remember turning on the sink, trying to stop the bleeding with hand towels as blood spurted around the room. I don't even recall getting into the car, but I was taken to the emergency room. That was over 20 years ago. My hand healed, but I'm left with a small scar on my palm. Light-colored flesh where there's no sensation. When I tell the story now, I usually just say I was stabbed through the hand with a sword as a teenager, skipping over the absurd details that make the story even more ridiculous. The same person who pulled this prank later attempted another one. He held a knife directly above a sleeping person's eye so that when they woke up, the first thing they'd see was the blade. Thankfully, that prank only resulted in a scream and no injuries. Looking back, I realize he wasn't exactly the healthiest person to have as a friend. Story 10. One time during a sleepover, we found a pack of craft singles in the fridge and, for reasons only sleep-deprived kids can understand, decided to put one over the nose and mouth of a friend who had fallen asleep on the couch before everyone else. The cheese immediately softened and created a perfect, airtight seal over his face. Within seconds, we realized he wasn't breathing, and everyone freaked out, but very quietly, of course, for about 10 seconds. Then we heard a faint chewing sound. This dude, half asleep and unable to breathe, smelled the cheese, and instinctively ate a mouth-sized hole through the single, saving himself without even waking up fully. Naturally, we thought this was the funniest thing ever, so we used the entire pack, slapping slice after slice onto his face and watching as he unconsciously devoured each one just to keep breathing. Story 11. I've got plenty of stories, but here's one of my favorites. One night during our freshman year, 5 or 6 of us were hanging out at Michael's house. His parents had given us one rule: no making noise after midnight, or he'd be grounded. When his mom went to bed, she specifically told us to be quiet by 12. Fast forward to around 3 a.m., and things are starting to wind down. It's just me, Michael, and Max left awake. Max heads to the bathroom, and apparently, our noise from playing on the computer was a lot louder than we thought. Michael's mom came downstairs, and we hear her quietly scolding Michael. She turns off the lights and is about to head back upstairs when Max comes out of the bathroom. Now, Max's eyes hadn't adjusted to the darkness, but he could make out a figure standing in front of him. So naturally, after asking why the lights were off and getting no response, Max reaches out, starts feeling her face, and asks, "Who the hell is this?" At that moment, Michael and I had to stuff our faces into pillows to stop ourselves from bursting out laughing. Michael's mom just casually said hi to Max and then walked back upstairs, laughing the whole way. Story 12. When I was 10, I had a sleepover at my friend's house and accidentally peed on his couch. I know, 10 is kind of old for that, but it happened. I woke up in a full-on panic, only to realize the couch cushions weren't attached and were identical on both sides. So, naturally, I flipped the cushion over, changed into a spare pair of shorts, and went back to sleep like nothing happened. Crisis averted, or so I thought. Fast forward a year later. I'm at my friend's house again when his mom finds a massive, yellow pee stain on the underside of one of the couch cushions while they were rearranging furniture. Of course, she didn't suspect me. Instead, my friend's little sister got blamed for it. "Mrs. Schofield, if you're out there reading this, it was me. I peed on your couch and left it to marinate for an entire year." Edit. Some people think his mom might have discovered the stain on purpose while I was there, hoping to call me out or give me a chance to confess. That's unlikely. I visited their house dozens of times between the incident and the day she found it. They only noticed because they were rearranging the living room and considering throwing out the couch. It was pure coincidence that I happened to be there when it happened. Story 13. When I was a stupid kid, I got invited to a sleepover with a few other kids. We were all excited because the next day we'd be going paintballing, thanks to the generosity of our host and his parents. I knew most of the kids from school, but I was only really good friends with one of them. He had suggested they invite me since he knew I was into paintball. That night, we were all in the living room being loud, obnoxious kids, and, for reasons I still don't fully understand, I made a comment that was way out of line. I joked, loud enough for everyone to hear, that the host was probably upstairs banging his mom. Of course, everyone burst into laughter, thinking it was hilarious. But I said it so loudly that they could hear upstairs too, and his mom was not amused. The next day, at some point, it came up, and of course, they completely blamed the wrong person. No one knew it was me, and I never said a word. To this day, about 10 or 11 years later, I still think about it. It was such a rude, unnecessary comment, and I feel like someone should have outed me at the time. But hey, you live and learn, right? Story 14. This isn't the weirdest thing, but it's always stuck with me. A girl once told me about someone she knew who had a very unconventional way of satisfying herself. She explained that this person would hold onto the top of a door and do pull-ups, using the movement to, well, achieve pleasure. She even demonstrated the motion for me. Then, she took a long shower, using a detachable shower head. When she came out, she was silent and seemed a bit out of it for a while. It didn't click with me until years later, but she had the most defined arms of anyone I knew at the time, especially for someone our age. She played soccer, but her upper body strength was unreal. I also realized that no one would make up something so bizarre, especially when she was really good at it. I tried the same thing later, thinking it might be a new trick, but I could barely lift myself a few times. In the end, she had a very unique method of getting off using the corner of her closet door and doing pull-ups. Story 15. I was at a sleepover at my best friend's house when we were about 12 or 13. Before the night kicked off, we decided to head to the corner store to grab a bunch of Jolt sodas and junk food. We were determined to be the first ones to actually stay up all night. We tried before, staying up late playing Battletoads or Cyborg Justice. You know, the golden age of gaming, right? The usual sleepover routine: video games, snacks, and of course, HBO's Real Sex, which we pretty much planned the sleepovers around. This time, we were having a blast with some empty pizza boxes, turning them into ramps for our penny racers. Around 3 a.m., we decided we needed more snacks and soda, so we headed upstairs to grab some more. The house was split level, so there was this big half-circle window above the front door that gave you a great view when you were on the top floor. So, while my friend was grabbing our snacks, I looked out the window just out of curiosity. That's when I saw something that made my heart drop. A beat-up van pulled into the driveway. At first, I thought maybe they were just turning around. But nope. The van stopped, the engine cut, and then all the doors swung open. We're talking about a full-size van with a sliding door and double doors in the back. Out poured about 8 to 12 guys, all carrying crowbars, pipes, and all kinds of street weapons. Now, I may have been young, but I was smart enough to know something wasn't right. I didn't hesitate. I called to my friend while I ran down to the front door, flipping the outside light off and on. My buddy, who knew the house better than me, started flipping the inside light on and off too. The guys freaked out, jumped back in the van, and sped off into the night. We figured they were probably after my friend's parents' classic Cadillac parked in the driveway. The older I get, the more I wonder if they were a crew of home invaders. Either way, my friend convinced me not to call the police or wake his parents up, since we were way too late and had done this sort of thing before. The next morning, I told his parents about what happened, and they didn't believe me, thinking I had just dreamed it up. I wasn't offended, though. We knew each other really well, and they were like a second family to me. I was just glad nothing happened to them. To this day, I'm a night owl, and I've stopped a few crimes myself, even making 3 citizens' arrests. I don't think anyone will see this post, since it's buried deep in the thread, but I'll never forget those guys. Definitely up to something shady. The area where we lived back then was known as one of the highest crime small towns in the US, though it wasn't as bad at the time. Maybe we didn't notice the danger when we were younger, but my friend's house was in a quieter, suburban part of town. Either way, we saved that Cadillac, and his parents let him use it when he turned 16. We had some amazing times in that car. Story 16. It was my first sleepover with both boys and girls. I was about 17, and there were no parents around, so, naturally, it felt like the perfect opportunity to have a bit of fun. Nothing wild happened, though. I just hung out with my friends, had some laughs, and thought everything was going fine. But the next morning, I woke up to find all my mates laughing at me and every girl there completely ignoring me. Turns out, a girl I'd been flirting with and kissing the night before had come to wake me up in the middle of the night. I have no idea why, though. I like to assume it was to say something mean or tease me. But, in my sleep, I must have been in some weird state because I ended up full-on punching her right in the face. I was so confused when I woke up. Everyone was mad at me. None of the girls would even look at me, and the boys were just laughing at my misfortune. It took a full week before someone finally told me what I had apparently done. Even now, I still cringe when I think about it. It's one of those moments that I'll never live down. Story 17. It was one of those nights where my 2 best friends were sleeping over at my house, and we had all decided to crash in the living room. We were all over 18, just enjoying each other's company, chatting and laughing until we finally passed out. At some point in the middle of the night, I woke up and noticed that one of my friends wasn't asleep. I could see that the bathroom light was off, so I knew she wasn't in there. I figured maybe she had gone to sleep in my room, but when I listened closer, I heard her giggling, followed by my brother laughing too. The sound was coming from the computer room, and it hit me immediately. I stayed perfectly still, pretending to be asleep, as they walked out of the computer room, clearly not noticing me. My friend laid back down next to me, and everything went silent again as she drifted off to sleep. I didn't say anything to either of them. They ended up dating for a few months after that night, but it didn't last long. She eventually cheated on him. Looking back, I never spoke a word about what I had overheard, and I guess it was better that way, but I still think about it from time to time. Story 18. When my younger sister was in high school, she decided to invite a big group of her friends over for a sleepover. My older brother and I decided it would be best to give them some space, so we headed out to avoid cramping their style. I can't remember exactly where we went, but by the time we came back, it was pretty late. We parked the car, and without saying a word, we made a beeline for the garage and grabbed a couple of axes. Now, I swear to you, there was absolutely no plan behind this. It just seemed like the right thing to do at the time. We walked into the house, axes in hand, and began limping dramatically forward, holding them up like we were straight out of a horror movie. We shuffled through the living room, our movements exaggerated for effect, and zombies stumbled through the dining room. The girls had all gathered in the sunroom, huddled together, doing whatever high school girls do at sleepovers. The only one not with them was a girl who had fallen asleep in the dining room, just outside the sunroom's glass doors. That's when we knew we had to strike. We moved closer, moaning loudly, raising our axes, and then, without much precision, brought them down over and over, sort of vaguely in the direction of the sleeping girl. And that's when it happened. We were seen. The scream that followed was something else. It was so piercing, so high-pitched, and so filled with pure terror that it felt like the sound was vibrating through the house. It was glorious. Our parents rushed down the stairs in their pajamas, and by the time they reached us, my sister and her friends were laughing uncontrollably. Some of them even shouted, "Do it again!" My poor parents, trying to maintain some level of authority, struggled to keep stern faces. My mom attempted to give us a lecture, but she couldn't hold it together. "Don't you," she started, but then trailed off, clearly fighting a smile. "Try to pretend to kill your sister with an axe." All in all, it was a perfect night. 10 out of 10. Would absolutely do it again. Story 19. This is a true story, but I know you probably won't believe it. When I was 8, I was staying the night at a friend's house, and my foster brother was with me. My friend asked if we wanted to see a cool trick, so we said yes. He lay down on the floor, pulled his pants down, and lifted his feet up to his face while wearing tidy whities. What happened next is burned into my memory. He let out a fart, and I saw a small spot, about the size of a dime, begin to darken on his bottom. Then, the spot got darker, and a hole started to form in his inner, right before my eyes. He burned a hole through his undies with a fart. I know it sounds unbelievable, but I swear it happened. We were so shocked, we asked him to do it again. So, he did. This time, I watched even more closely. After a minute of him getting a fart ready, he let out the same quiet fart with a soft pfftdd sound. The fresh pair of briefs he was wearing began to darken. My foster brother and I stood by, watching this strange phenomenon with intense curiosity. The dime-sized spot turned darker and darker, but it wasn't wet. There was no visible flame, but it looked like I was watching something burn in the sun. The way sunlight can make a flame nearly invisible. It was like that, but under the light of a bedroom lamp. Then, the hole formed, and this whole process took about 4 or 5 seconds. There was a little smoke, but I might have imagined it. The smell? It was a combination of a fart and burning rubber, intense and odd. My foster brother and I discussed it for a moment and asked for a third demonstration. He hesitated and said he shouldn't because his mom gets mad when he burns holes in his inners. It wasn't aliens, ghosts, or Bigfoot. It was just a boy who could burn a hole through his undies with his flatulence. And I swear it's true. Oh, and another strange thing happened earlier that night. His brother came in offering us toothpaste. When we declined, he shrugged and squeezed a third of the tube into his mouth and ate it. It was a bizarre night. Story 20. My friends and I went out to a small town in Nebraska to celebrate our buddy's high school graduation at his uncle's house. There were at least 10 of us, and we were all packed into this tiny basement. Someone brought a bunch of acid, so we all took some and spent the night tripping pretty hard. The uncle, whom none of us had ever met and didn't even know the name of, was sound asleep upstairs while we were giggling, goofing around, and completely losing our minds. The basement had a bunch of football decorations, but there was no clear theme, just random footballs and stuff scattered about. We decided to call him the football fan, joking that he wasn't a fan of any particular team, just someone who loved a hard-fought game. We kept repeating that line throughout the night, getting a good laugh out of it. As we kept tripping harder, an odd feeling started creeping in. We started to get the sense that the football fan somehow knew exactly what we were up to and was just waiting outside the basement door. The legend of the football fan began to grow. We started imagining all kinds of wild backstories for him and his mysterious powers. Our fear of him grew too, and soon, no one wanted to go upstairs. We were so paranoid we just started peeing in bottles and snacking on Slim Jims, too scared to leave the basement. The next morning, we quickly hid all 12 of the bottles of piss and the empty Slim Jim packages behind some cans of paint before making our hasty exit. We left, trying not to make eye contact with the football fan, convinced that he somehow knew everything we'd done. By the time we peeked, we were sure he was some all-knowing, all-powerful football being. It was probably the weirdest and most paranoid experience any of us had ever had. Story 21. I'm not sure if this qualifies as truly messed up, but at the time, it felt like a bizarre mix of glory and horror. My dad, who was super strict, came out to the living room where we were having a sleepover and told us we were being way too quiet. Without warning, he had us put on our shoes and jackets, then drove us to the warehouse store and bought an absurd amount of toilet paper, like enough to fill up a minivan. Then he did something I definitely didn't expect. He drove us around the neighborhood and had us TP the houses of everyone who didn't come to my party. He even made sure we got the house of the guy who turned me down for the middle school dance. Meanwhile, Dad just chilled in the minivan, keeping an eye on the neighborhood, probably sipping on a beer or two. It was the 80s, after all, and that was a pretty normal thing back then. Looking back, it was hilarious. Word got out quickly about our little revenge mission, and by Monday, my reputation was firmly established. Do not mess with me. If you got an invite, you better show up. For the next 4 years of secondary school, I was the girl no one dared to mess with. It was a hell of a reputation to live up to, but I owned it. In hindsight, Dad was actually pretty cool about it. But there was one thing for sure. You didn't mess with him or his kids. And as for sleepovers, well, I go way back with those. I had one broken up by riot cops when I was 8 or 10, but that's a story for another time. Story 22. This happened back in 2003, when I was in the 5th grade, around 11 years old. By that point, I had started developing more empathy and had a filter for what I would and wouldn't say around others. I also spent more time with the girls at my school than with the guys, but not because I was a horn dog or anything. I've always had a more feminine side to me. Not gay, just more compassionate and nurturing, I guess. One Saturday, I went over to my friend's house. Let's call her Catalina. I need to give a bit of background on Catalina's situation. She grew up without a father, and her mom worked long hours, from 7 to 9 every day. So, Catalina was often alone, and I'd hang out with her to make sure she wasn't lonely. On this particular night, like many Saturdays, Catalina's mom was asleep after a long shift. Around midnight, Catalina was getting tired, but I wasn't feeling sleepy just yet. She got into her pajamas and invited me to her room, so I followed her up. Now, you might be thinking that something inappropriate happened, but it didn't. Instead, something really sad unfolded. Once we got to her room, she started crying quietly. Being the empathic person I am, I immediately asked her what was wrong. She opened up about how no one ever cared when she went to bed. Her mom would just point to her room and give a quick good night, but there was never any real care. That broke my heart. I asked her what I could do to make her feel better, and she asked me to sing her a lullaby. That request hit me hard. Some of you might think that singing a lullaby to an 11-year-old girl is strange, but I didn't care. I couldn't stand the thought of her feeling so alone, and I wanted to do something for her. So, I sang. I sang as she fell asleep, holding back my own tears the whole time. When I was sure she was asleep, I wrote her a note. It was simple, just an apology and an offer that if she ever needed anything, she could call me. I left quietly after that. I didn't want to overstay my welcome, especially since I had a feeling her mom wouldn't even remember inviting me over. She was probably stressed and a bit drunk, and you don't want to get on the bad side of a mom in that state. It was a strange, emotional night, but one that stuck with me for a long time. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.